Years ago, my life changed in a way I never thought possible. I was in a car accident that left me bedridden for weeks. The pain was constant, sharp, and unforgiving, but honestly, it wasn't the physical recovery that hurt the most. It was the betrayal. My stepmom accused me of stealing the car, and my dad kicked me out without even listening to my side of the story. At the time, I was 17, just a few days away from my driving test. I wasn't some reckless teenager sneaking around. I'd asked my stepmom, Linda, for permission to take the car for a short practice drive. My dad always made it clear that I needed to get approval from either him or Linda before using the car. That day, Linda had said yes without hesitation. She even handed me the keys herself. I didn't go far, just around the neighborhood. I was nervous but excited, focusing on every stop sign and turn. But then, in an instant, everything went wrong. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the back of the car. The sound of metal crunching still haunts me. My head hit the steering wheel, and everything after that was a blur. I remember paramedics, flashing lights, and Linda's panicked voice on the phone with my dad. When I woke up in the hospital, the pain was overwhelming. My ribs felt like they were on fire, and every breath came with a stabbing ache. But worse than the physical pain was the way Linda's attitude had changed. She wasn't the worried stepmom I remembered from the phone call. Instead, she acted cold, distant, almost annoyed. The accusation started that same night. Linda told my dad I had taken the car without permission to impress some friends. She said she'd explicitly told me not to, and that I'd ignored her. None of it was true, but she said it with such confidence that my dad believed her. I tried to explain, but he didn't want to hear it. "Why would Linda lie about this?" he said, his tone cold and dismissive. I felt like I was screaming into a void. I was 17, scared, in pain, and completely alone. Linda's lies didn't stop there. She told my dad she'd overheard me bragging about sneaking out, saying I wanted to show off. I didn't even have the energy to argue anymore. Every time I tried to speak, my dad would cut me off, telling me I needed to take responsibility for my actions. Responsibility? I could barely sit up in the hospital bed, and he was lecturing me about responsibility. After I was discharged, my dad sat me down, or rather, stood over me, and told me I couldn't stay in the house anymore. He said I needed to learn the consequences of my behavior. I begged him to reconsider. I was still recovering, still in pain, and had nowhere else to go. But he wouldn't budge. He said Linda didn't feel safe with me in the house, and that was that. My grandparents came to get me the next day. I'll never forget the look on my grandpa's face when he saw me struggling to carry my bag. He didn't say anything in front of my dad, but as soon as we got in the car, he muttered, "Unbelievable." That one word said it all. Living with my grandparents was a relief, but it also felt like a defeat. They were wonderful, kind, supportive, and ready to do anything to help me heal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been abandoned. My dad didn't call to check on me, not once. Every day, I stared at my phone, hoping for some sign that he cared, but it never came. Linda, of course, made sure to drive the wedge even deeper. She told family members I was out of control, that I was a danger to myself and others. Some believed her, others didn't, but no one confronted her, least of all my dad. He just let her rewrite the story however she wanted, while I was left to pick up the pieces. The thing that sticks with me the most isn't the pain from the accident or even the lies. It's the silence. My dad didn't just choose Linda's version of events over mine. He chose to erase me from his life altogether. And for the life of me, I still don't understand why. Moving in with my grandparents felt like stepping into a completely different world. Their house was warm and quiet, filled with the kind of unconditional love I hadn't realized I was missing until then. My grandma hovered over me constantly, making sure I took my medication and ate enough, while my grandpa made it his mission to keep my spirits up with terrible jokes and stories from his youth. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. But that safety didn't erase the ache of being cast aside. Every time I thought about how easily my dad had believed Linda, it was like a fresh wound opening. He didn't just fail to defend me, he actively pushed me out of his life. It wasn't just betrayal, it was abandonment. I tried not to dwell on it, but it was impossible not to notice his absence. He didn't visit, didn't call, didn't even send a text. My grandparents told me to focus on getting better, but late at night, lying in bed with the pain from my injuries keeping me awake, all I could think about was why I wasn't enough for him to fight for me. About a month after I moved in with my grandparents, my grandpa decided he'd had enough of my dad's silence. One Sunday morning, while I was still half asleep, he called my dad and told him to come over. I only caught bits and pieces of the conversation, enough to know my grandpa wasn't holding back. When my dad finally showed up that afternoon, I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't seen him since the day he told me to leave, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he apologize? Would he even acknowledge what he'd done? He didn't. Instead, he acted like nothing had happened. He walked in with that same stiff, distant look on his face and asked how I was doing, like we were old acquaintances catching up. It was so jarring that I didn't even know how to respond. Better, thanks to them, I said, motioning to my grandparents. My voice was colder than I intended, but I couldn't help it. He nodded, glancing around the room like he was looking for an exit. My grandpa wasn't having it. You owe her more than small talk, Jack, he said, his tone sharp. My dad sighed, like this whole thing was an inconvenience to him. I just want to make sure you're doing okay, he said, looking at me briefly before shifting his gaze to the floor. Now you care? The words slipped out before I could stop them. My voice cracked, and I hated how vulnerable it made me sound, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. Where were you when I needed you? When I couldn't even walk without help? You just threw me away. He flinched but didn't deny it. For a second, I thought I saw guilt flicker across his face, but then he just muttered, "It wasn't like that." It was exactly like that, I shot back. My hands were trembling, and I had to grip the edge of the couch to steady them. You believed her over me. You didn't even ask me what happened. You just decided I wasn't worth it. My grandma reached out to touch my arm, probably to calm me down, but I shook my head. I didn't want to calm down. I wanted answers. My dad opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then he stopped. He looked at my grandparents, then back at me and said, "I think I should go." Coward, my grandpa muttered under his breath, loud enough for all of us to hear. My dad froze for a moment before walking out the door. I didn't cry until I heard his car drive away. That night, my grandparents sat with me in the living room, saying nothing but making sure I knew I wasn't alone. My grandpa eventually broke the silence, saying, "He's a fool, but that doesn't mean you are. You've got a good head on your shoulders, and you'll come out of this stronger." I wanted to believe him, but all I could think about was how much it still hurt. As the weeks turned into months, I focused on recovering, both physically and emotionally. My grandparents were incredible, doing everything they could to support me, but there was still a part of me that kept waiting for my dad to come back, to say he was sorry, to prove he cared. He didn't. Instead, I started hearing more from relatives about how Linda was spinning the story. Apparently, she was telling anyone who would listen that I was out of control, and that my dad had no choice but to send me away. Some people believed her, others didn't, but no one confronted her. My grandparents did their best to shield me from it, but the whispers still found their way to me. Each one felt like another little stab, another reminder that she was winning while I was still trying to piece my life back together. By the time I was finally able to walk without crutches and start thinking about college again, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let Linda or my dad define me. They had taken enough from me already. It was time to move forward, even if it meant leaving them behind. The decision to move forward without my dad was easier to make in theory than in practice. Cutting someone out of your life sounds clean, almost empowering, but the reality is messy. Even as I focused on my recovery and getting ready for college, there was always this nagging thought in the back of my mind. Why hadn't he fought for me? That question lived rent-free in my head, no matter how much I tried to push it away. My grandparents were my saving grace during those months. My grandma helped me get through the final steps of physical therapy, never letting me slack off even when I wanted to. My grandpa, on the other hand, was the master of distraction. He dragged me out of the house to run errands or get ice cream, always finding little ways to make me laugh when I felt like I had nothing left to give. One day, after a particularly exhausting round of college application essays, my grandpa sat me down and said, "You're going to do amazing things, you know that?" And not because of him, but in spite of him. His words stuck with me. I didn't need my dad's approval to move forward. I didn't need him at all. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. By the time I was accepted into a few colleges, I'd managed to convince myself I was fine. I threw myself into preparing for the move, picking out dorm essentials, and dreaming about what life would be like once I finally left. My grandparents were thrilled for me, but I could see the sadness in their eyes when we talked about me leaving. They'd been my rock through everything, and the idea of being far from them scared me more than I wanted to admit. As my departure grew closer, I started hearing less and less about Linda. It was almost like she'd disappeared, which should have been a relief, but it just made me uneasy. People like her don't just stop meddling. They wait for the perfect moment to strike. Sure enough, a few weeks before I was set to leave for college, I got a message from her. I hadn't heard from her since the day I left my dad's house, so seeing her name pop up on my phone felt like a punch to the gut. The message was short, almost polite, but it was laced with manipulation. She wrote, "It's been a while. I thought you'd like to know your dad misses you, even if he doesn't say it. He's too proud to reach out, but I know he wants to. Maybe it's time to mend things. Life's too short to hold grudges." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart racing. I didn't trust her, not for a second, but the idea that my dad might actually miss me hit harder than I expected. Was it possible she was telling the truth? Or was this just another one of her games? I showed the message to my grandparents, and my grandpa's response was immediate. "Block her. She doesn't deserve another second of your time." My grandma, always the gentler one, said, "You don't owe her a response, but if you're curious, you can always talk to your dad directly. Just be careful." I thought about it for days. Eventually, I decided to take my grandma's advice. If there was any truth to Linda's message, I needed to hear it from my dad, not from her. I sent him a simple text, "Hey, can we talk?" His reply came faster than I expected. "Of course. When and where?" We met at a diner near my grandparents' house. I arrived early, partly because I didn't want to keep him waiting, but mostly because I needed time to steady myself. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older, more tired, like the weight of the world was sitting on his shoulders. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as he slid into the booth. I nodded, not sure how to start. The silence stretched between us, heavy and awkward. Finally, I broke it. "Linda messaged me." His expression darkened, and he let out a long sigh. "What did she say?" I repeated her message, watching his face carefully. He looked more annoyed than anything else, which was both frustrating and oddly comforting. "I didn't know she'd reach out to you," he said. "We're not exactly on good terms right now." I raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, his voice quieter, "I've started to see her for who she really is. But that doesn't excuse what I let happen. I screwed up, and I know it." I folded my arms, unsure if I believed him. "Why did you believe her? Why was it so easy for you to throw me out?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at the table, his jaw tight, before finally speaking. "Because it was easier to believe her than to admit I'd failed as a parent. I thought I was protecting her, protecting our family, but I wasn't. I was just avoiding the truth." His words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the righteous fury that had kept me going for so long. But hearing him admit that, it cracked something open. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice trembling. "Not yet." He nodded, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years, regret. "I'm not asking you to. I just want a chance to try to fix things." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, and we sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. After our awkward meeting at the diner, I wasn't sure what to feel. My dad's regret seemed genuine, but I'd been burned by him before. It was hard to believe that one conversation could change years of pain. Still, I couldn't completely shut him out. Maybe I wanted to see if he'd actually follow through on his promise to try. Maybe I just wasn't ready to give up on the idea of having a father who cared. The weeks that followed were strange. My dad started texting me more often, just small things, asking about my classes, how I was settling into college, or even sharing a joke he thought I'd like. It wasn't much, but it was consistent. For someone who'd spent so long ignoring me, that consistency mattered more than I wanted to admit. He asked if we could meet again, and though I hesitated, I eventually agreed. This time, we met at a coffee shop near campus. He arrived early, holding 2 cups of coffee, and handed me one when I walked in. "Still like caramel lattes?" he asked, his voice tentative. I nodded, surprised he even remembered. We sat down, and for the first time, our conversation felt normal. He asked about my classes, and I told him about a professor who seemed to take pleasure in making everyone's life miserable. He laughed, and for a moment, it felt like we were 2 regular people catching up. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "I've started going to therapy," he said, looking down at his cup. I froze, unsure how to respond. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, his tone serious. "After our last conversation, I realized I've got a lot to work on. I let Linda control too much of my life, and I didn't see the damage I was doing until it was too late." His admission left me stunned. This was the man who had spent years brushing everything under the rug, who avoided difficult conversations like the plague. And now he was not only acknowledging his mistakes, but actively trying to fix them. It didn't erase the past, but it made me think that maybe he was serious about changing. Over the next few months, we kept meeting, and little by little, the walls I'd built around myself started to crack. He still wasn't perfect. There were moments when he'd say something thoughtless, or when his attempts to reconnect felt clumsy, but he was trying. That effort mattered more than I expected it to. One night, after dinner at my grandparents' house, he stayed behind to talk to them. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I caught bits and pieces, him apologizing for putting them in a position where they had to step in, thanking them for taking care of me when he didn't. My grandpa, who had been my fiercest defender through everything, softened just enough to shake his hand before my dad left. It was a small moment, but it meant the world to me. For so long, I'd felt like I was carrying the weight of all the damage on my own. Seeing him take responsibility, even in small ways, lifted some of that burden. Meanwhile, Linda was still lurking in the background. She hadn't contacted me again, but I knew through family gossip that her and my dad's divorce wasn't going smoothly. She tried to frame him as controlling and manipulative in court, which was ironic considering that was exactly what she had been. Luckily, her lies didn't hold up, and the divorce was finalized without much delay. My dad told me later that letting her go was both the hardest and easiest thing he'd ever done. "She made me feel like I needed her," he said one afternoon. "Like without her, I wouldn't have anything. But the truth is, I lost more with her than I ever gained." I wanted to tell him I'd been saying that for years, but I bit my tongue. It wasn't the time for an "I told you so." Around the same time, he brought up the idea of family therapy. "I know I've got a long way to go," he said, "but I want to understand how to do better. For you." It was a lot to process. Therapy had been my safety net for so long, the one place I could unpack everything that happened without judgment. The idea of sharing that space with him made me nervous, but it also felt like the next step. I agreed, cautiously. Our first session was awkward, with me doing most of the talking while he sat quietly, nodding along. But as the sessions went on, he started opening up. He admitted how much guilt he carried for believing Linda's lies, how ashamed he was of the way he treated me, and how scared he was that he'd lost me for good. Hearing him say those things didn't magically fix everything, but it helped. It was proof that he wasn't just saying the right words. He was willing to do the hard work to back them up. For the first time in years, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild something real. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't erase the past, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. As therapy sessions continued, my dad and I started peeling back more layers of our relationship, or rather, the lack of one we'd had for years. It wasn't easy. There were times when I wanted to walk out of the room, especially when he said something that felt like an excuse rather than accountability. But the therapist was good at steering us back on track, and eventually, I realized he wasn't making excuses. He was trying to understand himself as much as I was trying to understand him. One session, we dug into the accident, the lies Linda told, and his decision to kick me out. I thought I'd already made peace with it, but saying it all out loud, with him sitting there, was harder than I expected. I told him how it felt to wake up in a hospital bed and realize I was completely on my own. How every time I tried to defend myself, he shut me down. How it wasn't just about believing Linda. It was about him not even giving me the chance to be heard. He listened, which was something new. For the first time, he didn't interrupt or try to justify his actions. When I was done, he took a deep breath and said, "I should have been there. I should have protected you, not pushed you away. I can't undo what I did, but I'll never forgive myself for it." Hearing him say that didn't erase the pain, but it helped. It was proof that he was finally facing the reality of what he'd done. Outside of therapy, our relationship started to feel less strained. He called just to chat, or send me random pictures of things that reminded him of my childhood, like the old swing set in the backyard or a crayon drawing I'd made when I was 7. It was small, but it felt like he was trying to rebuild from the ground up. My grandparents noticed the change too. My grandpa, who had been the most skeptical of my dad's intentions, admitted one night over dinner that he was impressed. "It takes a lot for someone like him to admit he's wrong," he said, shaking his head. "Doesn't mean he's off the hook, but he's earning his way back." Around this time, I started hearing less about Linda. After the divorce was finalized, she disappeared from the family's radar. No dramatic outbursts, no attempts to stir up more trouble, just silence. I half expected her to try to contact me again, but she didn't. Maybe she finally realized she'd lost her grip, or maybe she was just biding her time. Either way, I wasn't going to let her back in. One evening, during a casual dinner at my dad's house, he surprised me with something I wasn't expecting. "I've been going through some old stuff," he said, pulling out a box from the closet. The box was filled with things from my childhood. Report cards, art projects, photos of us from years ago. Seeing all of it brought back a wave of emotions. I hadn't seen most of these things since before Linda came into the picture. "I kept all this," he said, his voice quiet. "I just didn't know how to share it with you after everything that happened." I picked up a photo of us at the beach, back when I was maybe 6 or 7. He was holding me on his shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. It felt like a lifetime ago. "Why now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Because I want you to know that those memories still matter to me," he said. "Even when I screwed up, even when I wasn't there for you the way I should have been, you've always mattered to me." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to throw the photo back in the box and walk away. Another part wanted to believe him. In the end, I just nodded and put the photo back carefully, unsure of how to process everything. As the weeks went by, I started noticing little changes in him. He seemed lighter, less weighed down by guilt. He wasn't trying to rush things or force a perfect resolution. He was just there, showing up in ways he hadn't before. When I told him about a big project I was working on for school, he didn't just say, "That's great," and move on. He asked questions, gave me advice, and even helped me brainstorm ideas. It was such a stark contrast to the distant, indifferent father I remembered from before that it almost caught me off guard. I still had moments of doubt, moments where the old anger bubbled up unexpectedly. But for every time I felt that way, there were also moments of connection that reminded me why I was giving him another chance. Like the time he came to one of my presentations at school, sitting quietly in the back, but beaming with pride when it was over. Or the time he called just to tell me he'd fixed the old swing set in the backyard, even though I was too old to use it now. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a dad again. Not a perfect one, but a dad who was trying. And for now, that was enough. As time passed, my dad and I settled into this new version of our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be, but it was real. We were learning how to trust each other again, step by careful step. There were still moments when the past hung between us like a heavy curtain, but instead of ignoring it, we were finally talking about it. One day, after another therapy session, my dad invited me to dinner at his house. I hadn't been there since Linda moved out, and walking through the door felt strange. The space was quieter, emptier in some ways, but it also felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. We sat in the kitchen, eating takeout Chinese food because, as he admitted with a laugh, I'm still terrible at cooking. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from my classes to his latest therapy breakthroughs. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I've been thinking a lot about what forgiveness really means." I paused, chopsticks hovering over my plate. Yeah. He nodded, looking down at his hands. I know I don't deserve it. Not after everything I put you through. But I'm trying to accept that forgiveness isn't something I can demand or expect. It's something I have to earn, and even then, it's up to you. His words caught me off guard. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my anger, convinced that forgiving him would mean letting go of all the pain he caused. But hearing him say that he didn't expect forgiveness, that he understood it wasn't something automatic, made me feel something shift inside. I don't know if I'm there yet, I said honestly, but I think I'm closer than I used to be. He smiled, a small, almost sad smile, and nodded. That's more than I could have hoped for. As I drove home that night, I found myself replaying his words over and over. It wasn't just the apology or the effort he'd been making. It was the fact that he finally seemed to understand how much damage had been done and how long it would take to heal. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page, working toward the same goal. The turning point came a few months later, at my college graduation. My grandparents were there, of course, beaming with pride, but so was my dad. He sat next to them, clutching a bouquet of flowers that looked like he'd spent way too much time picking out. When my name was called, and I walked across the stage, I saw him stand up to clap. It was such a small thing, but in that moment, it meant everything. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside while my grandparents took pictures with some of my friends. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know if I've said that enough, but I am. More than you know." "Thank you," I said, and for the first time, I actually meant it. That night, as we all sat around a crowded restaurant table celebrating, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. I didn't want to keep holding on to the anger. It had been my shield for so long, protecting me from the pain, but now it felt like a weight I didn't need anymore. I didn't forgive him that night, not entirely. Forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a process, one I was still working through. But I let go of some of the resentment, enough to make room for something new. Since then, things have been better. My dad still has his moments. He's not perfect, and neither am I, but he's present in a way he never was before. He's the first to cheer me on when I succeed, and the first to offer support when I stumble. We still go to therapy now and then, though not as often. Most of our conversations happen over coffee or during long phone calls where he asks way too many questions about my work and personal life. It's not the relationship we used to have. It's better, because it's built on honesty and effort. Looking back, I don't think I'll ever forget what happened. The scars are still there, and they always will be. But they don't control me anymore. They're just a part of the story, not the whole thing. My dad once told me that rebuilding trust is like planting a tree. It takes time, patience, and care, but eventually, it grows into something strong enough to stand on its own. I think we're finally starting to see the roots take hold.